So good evening, friends. Good evening for all of us in India. And of course, good morning to Graham Dickson, who is our speaker. So it is very early morning for him. It's 7 a.m. in Vancouver, from where he is going to deliver this talk. Friends, Graham is a professor emeritus in the Royal Roads University in Canada. And it was my pleasure to meet him in June this year, where I heard him talking about the importance of mental health in creating a good healthcare organization as well as the leaders in the healthcare sector. And in fact, they are using mental health as also one of the important features in the accreditation systems in Canada. So I thought that Graham should talk to us about this very new concept in a way, but I think extremely important. So you have all received about the much greater details about Graham, which I'll not like to reiterate and eat upon his time. So over to you, Graham, to start your talk on creating a psychologically healthy organization using leads in a caring environment capabilities framework.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal, and it's a real pleasure to be given the opportunity to speak to all of you this evening on this particular topic. I'm quite passionate about both elements of the talk, if you like. That is the importance of psychologically healthy workplaces for organizations that employ knowledge workers and people who need their brains to function at the highest level. And of course, the practice of leadership itself, which is a fundamental trait or ability to give people the conditions for a psychologically healthy workplace. The project that I'm going to speak on tonight is a project that was sponsored by over 20 healthcare organizations working under the aegis of the Mental Health Commission of Canada. A number of other organizations working together. It is what is called the Leads Collaborative, and Healthcare Can, which is a national organization that represents the health authorities, most health authorities across the country of Canada. These entities collaborated together to generate this project. Myself, I got involved in this project because I was the principal investigator for the work that created the LEADS framework, and because I had done many projects where the concept of leadership was then married with the changes that people wanted to see happen within an organization. And as a consequence, the Mental Health Commission suggested that I do this work on behalf of the Mental Health Collaborative. The project that I'm going to describe to you, and that was outlined essentially in the document that you all received electronically, or at least I hope you will receive if you haven't already electronically, was to look at the 13 workplace conditions that the Mental Health Commission and the Canadian Standards Association had created to define the conditions that are necessary for a mentally healthy, a psychologically healthy workplace to be created. And the Mental Health Commission realized that for many of those conditions to be a priori, to be brought into place, the quality of leadership that was in that organization was fundamental for that to happen. And so they asked us to look at not just their workplace conditions, the 13 workplace conditions, but they wanted us to also look with how consistent are they and how reflective are they of the similar standards that had been established for the practice of leadership in Canada. As I mentioned, this is the particular resource that I'm hoping that we can send to you if we haven't already sent it. Dr. Agarwal, do they have this
Well,
from your office?
They will be all getting a copy after the webinar, and
Excellent.
it will be also put up on our resource center.
Excellent. And but there is a more detailed copy that if anyone is interested, they could contact the Mental Health Commission to get a copy of that, the Canadian Mental Health Commission. Now, in presenting this evening's webinar, I'm very, very conscious of the fact that I'm presenting to people in a different country. And your country is in a different state and different place than Canada in many facets of its existence. But I just rely on you as senior medical leaders in your country to take away from the discussion what works for you, what makes sense for you in the context in which you're working. No way can a Canadian dictate or prescribe what's appropriate behavior in India. But what I can do is share our experience with you and hope that some of that may make sense in the context in which you're working. The LEADS framework, I've mentioned what the standard is, and now I'd like to just quickly describe what the LEADS framework is. It's a piece of work that began 12 years ago, actually, and was set about to establish the leadership standards, the expectations we have of people who are leading change in organizations or in larger systems across Canada. And I was the principal investigator in that work. It's since been taken up across the country by the Canadian Health Leadership Network and what's called the LEADS Collaborative, and is guiding the development of leadership in pretty well most health authorities in all provinces, and certainly most national organizations in Canada, including the Mental Health Commission. And it was for that reason they chose the LEADS framework to be mapped to the psychological workplace standards, because if they wanted to engage people in leadership roles to actually implement the conditions inherent in the standard, they knew they had to have the leadership skill that LEADS represents. The 13 conditions that are found in the National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace are not unique to healthcare. And the reason they chose LEADS was because it's established to guide good leadership and management in the healthcare setting. Such standards don't necessarily exist outside of healthcare in other organizations. But the workplace conditions that the PSA standard represents are relative to any other organization. So LEADS gave them an opportunity to truly look at the health sector and build these standards into the health sector in a more effective way than maybe other sectors. In doing the work to compare the standards, naturally I had to look at the literature that relates to the psychological health of healthcare workers. And it's interesting to note that in our country, and I cannot comment on India, although I did read a couple of articles that implied that this is a growing issue, that healthcare workers in our country are more prone to miss work due to illness or disability, and in that is included major time off, extended care leave, for stress leave, mental health conditions, than most other professions. And in that sense, they also are likely to experience burnout, unique to healthcare to some degree, although probably not totally unique, because I think other entities such as the police force, for example, would experience this. That's compassion fatigue, and of course, with the 24/7 demand on people, sleep deprivation, which does contribute to unhealthy workplaces. They also, in the literature that I read, supported this contention that it makes sense that when you're working through healthcare workers, and in Canada, 85% of our budget that goes into the healthcare system goes in to hire people who deliver service. And as a consequence, if those people aren't healthy, then how can they possibly deliver the compassion and empathy and service quality that we are asking them to deliver? I think a great concern in our healthy workplaces is the growing level of people with mental health that are entering our system because our mental health system is itself not functioning at a level that we're comfortable. I think it's leading to a fair bit of, how would I say it, stress on nurses and doctors because we're seeing more violence in the healthcare workplace. And as these two quotes from the article by Post and Ross in 2017, who did a study on the impact of mental health of healthcare workers, you can see that they did find, and in measurable terms, that the quality of care did decline when the mental health of healthcare workers themselves was not as constructive or as positive as it should be. Let me now go take you through what the 13 workplace conditions that were outlined by the Mental Health Commission for a psychologically healthy workplace are. I'm not going to take a long time on each of these, and I've grouped them because there's some similarity between them as it relates to healthy workplaces. So in the first instance, psychological support, that simply means that an employee or a doctor or a nurse can see that there is some support of a formal nature within the workplace to assist them if indeed they are suffering from a mental health condition. They know they have somewhere to go to get that support. They can talk to someone and they can feel that the support is there. Secondly, an organizational culture. In some people's language, maybe that's an organizational climate. Culture and climate aren't exactly the same thing, but in this instance, a culture means an organization that is characterized by reasonable levels of trust, and not everything is done according simply to contract and by simply telling other people what to do. There is a culture of a degree of trust that exists. As part of that, you could expect that such a culture would also be characterized by civility and respect. In other words, the dignity of human beings are reflected. And I know in your culture, in your Vedic beliefs, the concept of dignity and respect is very important for people in your culture, regardless of position or status. Psychological job fit. That particular condition pertains to simply, are people working in roles where they're being asked to do things that they are trained to do and that they're capable of doing? I mean, the studies that have been done show that when people are pushed to do activity in their job that is beyond their comfort zone, both capability-wise, but maybe psychologically, they get overstressed, and that creates a psychological burden for them. Another key workplace condition, now this is the fifth one contained within the workplace standards, is the notion of growth and development. Knowledge workers, people who use their brains to deliver service, must have the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to develop. And if a workplace doesn't create those conditions, then it creates stress on those workers. In addition, if people are constantly put into the position where they contribute their abilities and do effective work, but never receive any reward or recognition, are not acknowledged for the work that they do, and I'd ask you to think about, have you ever done something that's worthy of note and then had someone else, maybe in a position of power, take credit for your success? How does it feel? Well, workers feel the same way. And it is important that there be some form of reward and recognition in the workplace for it to be psychologically healthy. A seventh component of the psychological standards is this notion of workload management. That's difficult in the modern world, I believe, with the advent of technology and computers. I think most people feel that their jobs are far bigger than them. So how an employer can assist employees, nurses, doctors, and others, to see their workload as manageable is fundamentally important, and not to put constant demands on them to do more in a world, essentially, that makes that easy to do. So workload management is fundamentally important for a healthy workplace. And the notion of engagement, of which there's such amount of literature out there, particularly in the concept of physician engagement, which is a course I teach to doctors across the country of Canada. This notion that there is a connection between the individual and the work itself. They believe that they're doing something important as they go to work each and every day. An 11th aspect of psychological health, sorry, maybe it's the 10th, is this whole concept of balance. Balance between work life and home life, between the demands put on a person and the ability to meet those demands. The whole point of balance is to feel that you are in a place where you can handle the demands that are put upon you when they come from different places in life. In this particular case, psychological protection, this notion that you can indeed go somewhere if something happens that is damaging to your psychological health. Maybe you have a peer you can talk to, that maybe you have another employee that you can talk to because you feel safe in that environment. And finally, and this is maybe counterintuitive to the whole notion of psychological health, but also this notion of a supportive physical environment. If persons' physical demands are put upon them, they're constantly being asked to do physical activity that is beyond their capability, that begins to put stress on them mentally as well. And the final workplace condition, and the one that I've saved to the last, is of course this whole notion of clear leadership and expectations. And that's what ultimately led us to looking at LEADS and the LEADS framework as a guide, because you cannot create those 13, the other 12 psychological workplace conditions. They cannot be created in a workplace if the leadership of that workplace is itself not mentally healthy and is not conscious of how their behavior impacts on each of those 12 psychologically dimensions. And of course, the Mental Health Commission said, well, if you behave according to LEADS, will that help create the psychological conditions that we've outlined? And that was the genesis of the study itself. I want to point out that we have some very iconic figures internationally, certainly one from your country and another from South Africa, who reflect much of the content of LEADS and who demonstrate and are representations of how important good leadership is, how it models the behaviors expected of others. In both of these instances, the power of the man was to reflect in how he approached the challenges that he faced, the productive way of acting that other people followed because it was modeled. In contrast to this man who drove his boat too close to an island to impress his girlfriend, and ultimately over 20 passengers ended up dying, and he abandoned his ship in contravention of his leadership responsibility. Each of us as leaders has the right and the capacity to make a choice. Are we going to lead well, or are we going to lead poorly? And the challenge for us as leaders is to remember that requirement, that responsibility, every single moment of every day, because you never know when your behavior is going to be observed by another and influence how another behaves. There are many studies that are coming out now, and it's interesting because I wrote a book or a chapter for a book in Australia, and there are many studies coming out now that are looking at the impact of toxic leaders, abusive leaders, supervisors who are overwhelmingly aggressive in the workplace and the impact they're having on people in that workplace. And you can see here that this study, I think it was done by Maxey in 2017, that regardless of what the policies and procedures of an organization are, if a leader or a manager shames a person in the workplace, that completely overrides even the best policies and procedures. And all of the studies show that that kind of behavior create universally negative psychological health responses from workers in the workplace. Universally negative, which means those behaviors contribute to unhealthy, psychologically healthy workplaces. In Canada, in order for us to truly understand and develop the kind of leadership that we needed for this to be important and to create psychologically healthy workplaces, we couldn't define and develop that leadership if we didn't make it clear. Someone once said to me, leadership is like fog. I can feel it and I can see it, but I can't get a hold of it. And what he essentially meant was that if someone said, well, who's a good leader? What is a good leader? It would depend. It would depend on the individual. It would depend on who was talking. It would depend on what one wanted to believe what a good leader is. And in our case, in Canada, in the health system, we said that's not good enough. That means anybody can be a good leader if they want to describe themselves as being a good leader. We need to define leadership. And we need to define it in a way that we can develop it. And we need to define it in a way that it creates the kind of psychological workplace conditions in which knowledge workers can thrive. And that definition in Canada was this one. And I and a colleague have written a book to explain this. It takes its expression as the LEADS framework in terms of outlining what people in Canada need to do in our Canadian health system to be effective leaders. But here is the definition. It is not, by the way, management. Management is another fundamentally important function that people in leadership and management roles must have. But leadership is this quality, the collective capacity. So if you work in a hospital, if you work in another health organization, it isn't just you. It's you and other people in roles and responsibilities of leadership and management. Of an individual and a group to influence people. And who are those people? Those people are the healthcare workers that we're talking about. To influence those healthcare workers to work together. And most patients are not just treated by one individual, not one healthcare worker. That the best and the highest quality of service delivery is usually done through teamwork. So the leaders are supposed to influence people to work together to achieve that common constructive purpose. And in this instance, a constructive purpose is a moral purpose. And healthcare has a moral purpose, and that is the health and wellness of the population or the individual patient that we're serving. That's the function of leadership. It's to make the changes necessary to take the actions fundamentally important to create that positive response for a patient's needs. We took that definition And we've worked with people in Australia. So there actually is a Health Leads Australia as well that has been taken up across that country in a variety of different jurisdictions. I just came back from Hong Kong, where a gentleman from Townsville in Queensland was asking me all about how to develop leadership because they're using Health Leads Australia. It's a way of taking that definition now and turning it into 5 domains of action and 4 capabilities, things good leaders need to be capable of doing to be effective in creating psychologically healthy workplaces. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go back. You can see the diagram says that essentially there are, in the 5 domains, they start with what we call the lead self domain. The lead self domain is that inward looking element of leadership, looking inside. What are my motives? Why am I doing this? What are my biases? And in particular, as it relates to mental health in the workplace, psychological health, do I have a stigma against people who present with mental health conditions? Do I treat them in a constructive and positive way? The second dimension of the LEADS framework is what we call engage others. So now that I know what I want to do as a leader, how do I engage others constructively to accomplish what I need to accomplish? And this is an element of LEADS that is very pertinent to the 13 psychological workplace conditions of the Mental Health Commission. But it's not good enough just to engage others in an organization. You have to engage others with an eye also to achieving results, productivity. A psychologically healthy workplace is good, and it's a worthwhile endeavor. But if it doesn't actually create constructive results for patients, then it has to change its practices. And part of the challenge in modern organizations is creating change in organizations to continue to be productive. And change itself puts a toll on psychological health. But we must balance both the quality of the workplace and results to be an effective leader. Now, in a lot of cases, some leaders, more often the senior leaders in a hospital, cannot deliver service without developing coalitions. Dr. Agarwal himself is the leader of a massive coalition of accredited entities in India. And he has to have huge skills in the area, not of just the other 3 elements, but developing coalitions, because coalitions aren't just simply made, they are deliberately constructed and maintained. And finally, if a leader wants to see a major change system-wide, India-wide, or region-wide, then that leader must be very skilled at having the skills of change in a systems context. So those are the 5 domains of LEADS, and we have 4 capabilities within each of those domains, and that's what we mapped to the 13 psychological healthy workplace conditions to show that the expectations we had of leaders through LEADS would actually create the 13 psychological workplace conditions in the health sector. So I shouldn't tell you that because we have LEADS in place that automatically everyone behaves accordingly. Of course they don't. It's an aspirational approach. It outlines where we want leaders to be. It's research-based. It has face validity, construct validity. In other words, it has a solid research foundation behind it. Spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building this framework so that it had that foundation to it. And it represents a discipline. It does not happen without an individual leader saying, okay, If I'm expected to be effective in my communications, there is a discipline to those communications. One can learn leadership. One just has to know what the expectations are and what the research says works. And the research now tells us what the discipline of good leadership is. Here are the capabilities of leads organized according to the specific domain of leads. And I'm not going to go through them all with you. What I would like to do is to go through the L and the A and only one of the lead self. In the lead self domains, I want to emphasize the whole notion of self-awareness. What are one's biases, the leader's biases, the leader's attitudes, the value predispositions they have as it relates to when people exhibit psychologically unhealthy behavior in the workplace? How do we react to that? How do we manage our own reaction to that? And if it isn't productive, how do we then develop ourselves? The demonstrate character element of lead self is something that I think is very much in keeping with the elements of a Vedic philosophy that many of my Indian friends have explained to me, and I will leave that to you to think about. But I think there are many character elements that are fundamental for effective leadership. In terms of engage others, you'll see that foster the development of others is a direct consonance to one of the psychological workplace conditions, which was almost similarly worded. Similarly, here, the creation of contribute to the development of a healthy organization. The whole notion of trust, how a leader behaves, leadership style, communicating effectively and building teams. One can see very quickly that all of these abilities, capabilities of a leader will contribute to a psychologically healthy workplace. Similarly, under A, I think most of us understand that people in organizations are much better off when direction is set. So when we had workload management, when we had the whole notion of not asking people to do beyond what they could do, setting direction in terms of what we expect from people in our organization is fundamentally important. I think ensuring that the decisions that we make are productive and incisive so that people can see what they have to do rather than wonder what they have to do. I think all of these elements you can see are very strongly supports for people in the workplace by you as a leader to create the conditions of a psychologically healthy workplace. So we took the notion of leads and the notion of the 13 workplace standards, and we compared the content of both to make that relationship explicit rather than simply implicit. And that's what created the booklet that you will be sent. And it's why I think Dr. Agarwal wanted me to explain this to you. From a philosophical perspective, in other words, the background of both, the commitment of both for what they were set out to accomplish, both the LEADS framework and the psychological standards emphasize caring for others, caring for people in the workplace, but caring for patients and the population as well. Both are aspirational frameworks. They set a bar. They say, behave this way and you will be successful. They don't say this is how behavior is. They said this is how behavior should be. And both seek to shift cultures in the workplace. Shifting cultures by being disciplined about approaching and using those standards to guide one's behavior. The leads domains most strongly represented in the psychological workplace conditions are, as I've mentioned before, I didn't emphasize the developed coalitions as much as I might, but they are in the engage others and the developed coalitions domain. The fundamental importance of a leader paying attention to the people in the orbit in which they're operating. In engage others, it's about paying attention to the workers in your workplace, to the other managers in your workplace, and having the interactions on a daily basis that are constructive, motivating, and energizing. In the case of developing coalitions, it's building the relationships across organizational boundaries that are fundamental to the success and the mandates of each of the organizations that are part of that broader coalition itself. Leads as a guide to leadership action. In the report, we looked at leads from two perspectives. First, if someone who behaved according to what leads asked them to behave, would they be contributing to psychological health of people in the workplace? And we came to the conclusion very quickly, and I think I've made that clear throughout the presentation, that yes, individuals who practice the capabilities of leads are modeling the leadership actions that contribute to psychologically healthy workplaces. So we look to in our own country. We're starting to develop programs now where we're taking them into organizations to exist here. Let's talk about what has to be done in your organization to create those psychologically healthy workplaces, and let's develop your leadership so that you are modeling those for the people that they're intended to be in place for. Secondly, psychological health and safety is embedded in the way people interact on a daily basis. The most important person in that interaction is you, the leader. You have power, authority, and influence. If you interact with people in a psychologically unhealthy way, the impact is exaggerated dramatically. So we as leaders need to understand the impact our behaviors are having, and we need to be conscious of what those behaviors are, and then disciplined about changing them if they're not constructive and they're not contributing to a healthy workplace. In the book that you're going to receive, you're going to get a very clear comparison of leads and the standards in the workplace, the 13 workplace standards. I'm not going to try to go through those with you now, but the booklet will give you those connections. So if indeed you come to the conclusion that we need to help develop our managers and leaders to exhibit the qualities of a good, healthy workplace, you can do so by working on the quality of their leadership. And I would suggest that be done maybe by creating a framework called Leads India that reflects the philosophy and approach of your country rather than of Canada. I've made this point over and over. I guess how important it is to the day-to-day interactions become really the model of which we create a healthy workplace or we don't. And it is important to point out, and we kind of make an assumption often, when we appoint people to managerial roles, that they are themselves psychologically healthy. And it may be incumbent upon us now in our organizations to actually look at how psychologically healthy are our people in our management roles. Because if they're not healthy, if they fall into the injured or ill dimension of mental illness, then they're going to start creating toxic, dysfunctional organizations. It is fundamentally important that we help our managers be mentally healthy, that they get the supports that psychologically healthy workers need, and that we pay attention to the kind of supports our management cadre needs as well. We cannot assume that all former leaders are themselves mentally healthy. Healthcare is a moral endeavor. If our leaders aren't driven by a moral compass, then maybe they shouldn't be leading. I'll leave that question with you. The last thing that the Mental Health Commission asked us to do was to look at leads not just from being a guide for modeling behavior, but also, is it also a guide that if you are psychologically healthy as a manager leader and you want to go about creating change in your workplace to actually implement the psychological standards, how would you go about doing it? What steps would you take? And using the leads as a guide, we came up with a 7-step model. And this is how it operationalizes itself. Leads can be seen as a change discipline. In other words, if you take it out of that realm of simply being a list of how the leader should behave, and you look at it as a dynamic way of thinking about change, the change discipline looks like this. In whatever organization you are the manager leader of, department or unit, the first thing you have to do is be absolutely clear about what it is you want to do in terms of creating a psychologically healthy workplace. What's your vision? What's the vision for your unit or department? What measurable results would tell you you are a psychologically healthy workplace? You then compare that to the current state. Well, I want all my doctors to be engaged, and on this survey, I want them 85% of doctors to say I'm engaged. All right, well, what's the current state? 20%. Wow, we've got a big gap. 65%. Not much of a gap at all. We only have to make some minor tweaks in what we're going to do in our organization. Comparing the gap between what is and what should be creates the focus and the environment for then your leadership action. And the first step after you've analyzed the scope and breadth of the gap is to then determine what you have to do with your leaders to fill that gap. And this is often forgotten. If you want to create an impact in a workplace, prepare your leaders to lead that. Show them what the gap is. Talk to them about what they can do collectively and individually to close that gap. Maybe the gap in their department or unit isn't the same as the organization gap, so they have to adapt to that situation. Maybe they're not psychologically healthy. If that's the case, are they in a position to lead the change process? If not, maybe someone else in their unit or department is. Fundamentally important, prepare those leaders. Once we know what the gap is and what it is we want to close, we then have to engage representatives of the workforce in deciding how to close that gap. What can we do to build this workplace condition in? What's working well now and what's not? How can we change things? If we can agree with the key representatives of the workplace on what to do, then we have a plan of action to follow. The next step is to make fundamentally clear that we are focusing on results. Remember, in the LEADS framework, it's not just about creating a nice place to work. It's about also knowing that we're working together to get results. So what are the results that we want to accomplish? Are we all conscious of that? And let's work towards them. Finally, not finally, but in step 6, engage outside entities that are maybe having an impact on our plan. If there's an outside organization or department or unit that we need to build into our plan to be a psychologically healthy workforce, how do we bring them in? And finally, not finally, I keep saying that, next step, step 7, be very good at understanding the dynamics of change. Help people through the change process. Because if we don't help people through the change process, then we are contributing ourselves to psychologically unhealthy workplaces. And that completes a cycle of action, which then can be repeated every second year or third year, but it is a discipline that leads can bring to the implementation of the workplace standards. I've given you in the booklet an example of the kinds of questions that a leader needs to answer for himself and with others to operationalize those steps. So when you get the booklet, you will see that these questions are outlined for you. And in this instance, for example, in stage 1, the questions are questions like, who should be involved in articulating a vision statement and desired results for our workplace? And why would they be important? You should have a vision, but if it isn't a shared vision, it's not a very powerful motivating force. So the questions help you decide who to involve and how to involve them. So that is indeed in the 48 or 49 minutes that I've been given to interact with you. That's how the Leads in a Caring Environment framework and the 13 workplace standards represented by the Mental Health Commission's product work together. Remember hearing a Sufi statement that you believe that 1 and 1 equals 2 because you understand 1. But 1 and 1 can equal 3 if you understand and. In other words, when good leadership and an understanding of what the workplace expectations are for workplace conditions, when they work together hand in hand, you can create those psychologically healthy workplaces that are so important for the patients that you're serving. Be it a private entity or a public entity, psychologically healthy workplace improves patient care. Thank you. I'm now open to any questions, however we choose to do that, Dr. Agarwal.
I think what a fantastic overview of this so important topic, which is absolutely overlooked, I would say, especially in our part of the world. And I definitely kind of take this thing for opening the Leads India chapter along under your able guidance, as well as I think we will like to do also some study of our own with our organization under your directions as to demonstrate to the people the need for this entire initiative to be taken very, very seriously. So we will of course be distributing the things to the here, and also I'm sure that the people who have listened to us today, we are trying to make an effort that if Graham and some of his friends can come over to India on the 12th of April, just a day prior to our annual conference in Mumbai, and where we can have almost a whole day workshop on this issue and maybe officially launch the Leads India program. So we'll be working on that. Your talk was so lucid, Graham, that I do not think that there should be a need of a lot more questions. But please feel free to give your reactions, all the people who are here today. Kindly, if you can just type out what you felt about the presentation.
And will I see that in the notes box there, Dr. Agarwal?
There is a chat box. Sam is one of our important. I can try to, move him to a panelist. So I'll tell Sam to also join and.
Yeah, and Dr. Agarwal, if you want to give people my email address, and
Yes,
if they
it is
want
already
to
in there.
email me directly, they can.
Sam, you want to share something?
Yeah, I had actually a question. I think this was one of the best sessions I've listened to. In most change management kind of sessions in any organization, there's always a conversation saying that you have to keep renewing the urgency of rebuilding a shared vision. Because once you build a vision, obviously the team has changed, or after a couple of years, there's always a feeling that, oh, the old vision is kind of like done, even though we're only partway through the journey. Have you had a lot of experience in this, Doc, where you have to keep re-energizing and re-engaging the shared vision?
Well, I think that's actually a fundamentally important demand on the leaders. And, it's intriguing that you say that because, the literature talks about things like burning platforms. You have to create a burning platform for change. And, frankly, I think if we do a good job of measurement, if we're absolutely clear on why we're measuring what we're measuring, and if we're clear on the results we're trying to accomplish, there's an obvious discrepancy between what we want to accomplish and where we're at. And that should be a huge motivator in and of itself. I find with a lot of leaders, they seem to think that it comes down to their own ability to speak in an incredibly and compelling way that inspires people to operate. And I think on a daily basis, words of support, words of compassion and empathy is important to get over those daily humps. But in terms of an overall vision on a regular basis, I think there's no harm in renewing it. I think what's fundamental to creating the sense of urgency, though, has got to be the numbers. It's got to be the results. And you've got to, as a leader, constantly appeal to people and say, look, are we on the right track? Look what our numbers are telling us. We're not getting any closer to our goal. Why aren't we? We better look at what we're doing and see how we can make a better pathway to those results. In healthcare, at least in Canada, now I'm not speaking about your country, but in Canada, that kind of discipline is lacking. And I think in the absence of measurable results, it's really hard to constantly be exhorting people to give more, give more, to give more. They have to see the results of their behavior. Does that help, Sam?
Yes, it does. Thank you. It's quite helpful.
Yeah. Graham, I think a lot of participants have all kind of expressed their immense satisfaction and gratitude for talking about this entire thing so eloquently. It has been a absolutely great session. I think Arun is probably also there, listening. Let me, if I can also just see if he's there, then I can bring him on the panel, because Arun Garg from Vancouver was instrumental in my visiting Vancouver and meeting Graham, and in a way. So thank you very much, Arun. Let me just see if I can bring him.
I'm very pleased to hear that Aaron is on the call.
Yes.
He's one of the colleagues that I've learned from.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Arun, we can hear you.
I'm on the call. I've heard the whole thing.
Yes.
Great presentation, and I'm really looking forward. Graham and I have spent quite a bit of time following up since our meeting. So we're quite excited to build this whole notion of leads in Indian context, not only in mental health, but in healthcare and general ethics, professionalism. This is very positive, very happy.
This will be So this will be a very great beginning, and I think an extremely new thing that we will be able to bring to India. And so thank you so much, Graham. Thank you so much, Arun, for making this happen. And we are looking forward to further constant interaction in this regard. And
I am looking forward to Dr. Agarwal. It would be marvelous to work with people who wish to create an Indian-owned leads framework.
yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Very welcome.
Okay.